Hey everybody, I'm Carl Lanning, Brazos River Charter School with This Week in History, specifically the week of July the 5th through the 11th. Well, let's see, first of all, on July the 8th of 1889, the last bare knuckle boxing championship occurred between the title holder, Mr. John L. Sullivan, and a man named Jack Kilrain. 8th of July, 1889, official one. Now, Sullivan knocked out Kilrain in the 75th round, what was scheduled to be an 80-round fight. Bare knuckle boxing had been illegal in the United States for 7 years, but the authorities in Mississippi were willing to overlook it because of the fact that, well, it brought in lots of people and it was liked by quite a few of them as well. This was probably one of the first nationally reported sporting events. Now, bare knuckle boxing went by a little bit different set of rules today we have the Marquess of Queensberry rules. At the time, is what was called the London rules, and this is what accounts for the sometimes huge number of rounds. Sullivan Kilrain went 75 of 80 rounds. There was no set time for a round under the London rules. The way it worked was a round was said to have ended when a man went down. Now, however, if you went down, you had 30 seconds to collect yourself, stand back up, and then 8 seconds to get back to your side of what they call the scratch line. Thus began the next round. Now, many fighters went down simply to catch their breath in some of these long fights. There's a little bit of debate over what exactly was the longest fight, but it looks like it was probably one that lasted 110 rounds, 7 hours, and it ended in a draw because both men were absolutely exhausted by the end of it. Now, bare knuckle boxing, you had another little problem too, and that was your hands. The glove is not to protect the person being hit, it's to protect the guy who's doing the hitting. So, the way boxers would try to protect their knuckles was literally just that, knuckle conditioning. And there was a lot of different ways of doing it, kind of varied from person to person. But one that seemed to be fairly common was to take sandpaper and rub from your knuckle down to the first joint of your hand into a bloody pulp and then soak it in pickle brine. You would then allow it to heal somewhat and repeat that process over and over, and eventually you've got a nice thick callus to help protect your hand. So, the last bare knuckle championship. Well, last week I mentioned this gentleman right here, who was involved in a publicity stunt that got a little bit out of hand. His name is John T. Scopes, and on July the 10th of 1925, what started out as an attempt to economically jumpstart the economy of a dying town turned into a circus and a worldwide news story. What popularly became known as the Scopes Monkey Trial began July 10th, 1925. Now, several months earlier, John Scopes, he was a science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, walked into a soda shop where the school superintendent and several of the town leaders were sitting around trying to think of some way to jumpstart the economy. There was a mill in town that had closed. Things were not going very well in Dayton, Tennessee. As it turned out, there had been several other big trials in various cities and states around that turned out to be economically a pretty good deal. So Scopes was asked by the school superintendent if he wouldn't mind breaking Tennessee law by teaching evolution in his high school biology class. He agreed. Now, several of the other people who were sitting around the table, one was a local lawyer. He agreed to be Scopes' defense lawyer. The local district attorney was sitting right there. He agreed to prosecute the case. Turns out that the ACLU had been actually advertising for somebody to break the law in Tennessee so that they could bring a trial. They actually offered to pay for the legal expenses. So an agreement was made. These fellows all knew each other. It was kind of a plot, I guess you'd say. Well, this got a little bit out of hand because the ACLU ended up hiring this man. That's Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow was known as the lawyer for the damned. If your butt was in a crack, that's the man you wanted. Probably the most famous lawyer in the country. And this gentleman is William Jennings Bryan, who had been a 3-time presidential candidate and a former Secretary of State. Darrell was the ACLU's lawyer. Bryan was the lawyer for one of the lawyers for the prosecution against Mr. Scopes. When this hit, it became a nightmare. The press was all over it. It was covered in newspapers worldwide. The trial was actually broadcast via telephone call through then radio across the country. People followed this all over the place. It was a gigantic story, and it did actually have the effect, I suppose you'd say, of economically giving Dayton, Tennessee a bit of a jump start, because people showed up from around the nation. This is a button-selling Buicks. Every hotel in town was packed. Restaurants were packed. People were renting out rooms in their houses. Every revival preacher that had a tent showed up. Everybody who had a book to sell showed up, regardless of which side it was on. So it did actually turn out to be a huge deal. In the end, though, as far as the case went, the ACLU was hoping to lose the case. The reason why was because then they could appeal into federal court and make it into a civil rights case. Well, Scopes was found guilty, and he was fined by the judge $100. That was a mistake, and it was done on purpose. According to Tennessee law, any fine greater than $50 had to be handed down by the jury. Therefore, the guilty verdict was essentially voided, and that, along with a few other things, helped keep it out of federal court. So the Scopes monkey trial. And finally, on July the 6th of 1925, Merv Griffin was born. Merv Griffin, of course, was a very famous talk show host for over 20 years. He also was the creator of the game show Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, which certainly did not hurt his net wealth. When he died, he had a fantastic sense of humor, very dry sense of humor. When he died, he wrote out exactly what he wanted on his headstone. And it's classic. Merv Griffin. I will not be right back after these messages. Merv Griffin, born on July the 6th, 1925. Well, thank you for your time. Just to let you know what's coming up, next week we will meet the man who made this process so much better. Until then, I'm Carl Lanning, Brazos River Charter School, and we look forward to seeing you right here next week.